I see many of my students, colleagues, friends, but sadly, I don't see any of my professors or even their cohorts, which means that maybe it's the time for me to leave somewhere. This is the first ponder, if you like. The second one is about the new normal. And for me, I have a new normal, and the new normal is this cane, which I'm used. But I think it's a temporary normal. My doctors say that in 3 months' time, I will be back to the old normal, which means walking steady on both legs. I'm happy to be here and happy that the topic of this conference and the theme of the opening plenary is so timely. At the time now we're reading news about a great trade war that has just started. And that trade war between two giants, the first and the second, first and second largest economies in the world. And probably they account for more shares of world trade. So if that means something, it means that for other countries, they had to be very, very careful about the nature of the economic environment within which they navigate their economies. I would like to organize my presentation as follows. This is the organizational bit. An introduction, not too long. Then some definitions and initial conditions, which I see as very relevant for the discussion of industrial policy. And then the issue of structural transformation in MENA, which is a very important issue. And then issues of industrial policy, which Professor Kyun Lee addressed at some length. I will try to keep within the boundaries of my mandate and also the time constraint, which is 15 minutes. But when I start to look, okay, economic transformation in MENA countries. What are MENA countries? Just to remind ourselves, this is the list of countries there. Oops. Yeah, the list of countries. They include not all Arab countries, most Arab countries, if you like, but they have other countries like Iran and Turkey, and this is according to the World Bank definition. And they leave other countries such as Mauritania, Somalia, and Sudan. Does that mean anything? It may not mean anything to some people, but it certainly makes something for some people. And that's the issue I want to stress. Now, the definition by there is another definition for the region by the IMF. The IMF has some other term called MENAP, M-E-N-A-P, Middle East, North Africa, and Afghanistan and Pakistan. Here again, I think the geographical definition is, if you want to think about a policy, are we going to talk about MENA or MENAP, or the Arab countries, or the countries that actually are under the mandate of ERF, which Arab countries, Iran and Turkey. That's the category that I think we should be concerned of. Anyway, I'll just raise this point for us to think about, but I would like to in the documents that were circulated to us, the question was how to achieve sustained growth. And when I read the term, I said, should we target sustained growth or sustainable growth? There is a big difference between the two. Actually, the difference is so big as to impact the lives of millions of people around the region and the world. As you know, the UN has settled for sustainable, and I think I would like to go for that as well instead of sustain, because sustainable meaning that when you make your economy grow, you're always mindful of certain constraints. Some of them are material constraints, such as resources, environment, whatever, and some are non-material, such as the social fabric. And as a former Minister of Solidarity and Social Justice, the issue of social justice, I think, is so vital when we ponder the term sustainable growth. Witness the events that were sparked in December 2010 and continued from January 2011. And I think it's an ongoing process until now. There was high growth in Egypt, at least, yet people were unhappy about who gains from that growth, and the issue of sustainability in that sense, in the social sense, is important. Okay, now, so instead of maximizing growth, we have to optimize growth, taking in consideration physical and social constraints. Okay. In terms of some definitions as well, about the new normal, but I wittily, raised my cane and said, this is a new normal for me. But when I read the documents, new normal meaning the new normal of low oil prices. I'm not sure that we're getting into a new normal of low oil prices. As you all observed, the oil price is approaching 80 barrels, and if things spark between the US and Iran for one thing, there's no telling how high the price can go. So is it going to be a new normal of low oil prices? I'm not really sure, but I'm raising the issue for us to think about. And if it's not the case, not going to be low oil prices, then in fact, it's going to be high oil prices. That will even be a curse for this region, given the history, the past history with high oil prices. Okay, I would like also, when we entertain thinking about industrial policy, in this region, we keep into consideration three initial conditions of it make the difference from, let's say, the Korean case. One is that the neoliberal policy stance or augmented Washington consensus, that's more or less being universally adopted in this region. And this is a starting point. Governments are confined with what they signed on off with regard to the, whether with the World Bank, the IMF, or both institutions. And then we have the lack of food security, which means that this is a very important issue to talk about sustainable growth and industrial policy. This country is the most food insecure region in the world, country in the world, and the region, MENA region, is the most food insecure region in the world. And if you want to entertain any type of economic policy, you should pay enough attention to that issue, because after all, as we know, food is a wage good. If you don't have enough food, then you're always at the mercy of the world food market, and you know what it is. It is very volatile, and it's going to disturb whatever decisions you try to implement regarding industrial. And then the high literacy rate This is very important. As we learned from the interesting presentation of Professor Lee, you're talking about innovation. Innovation means something to start with, you have people who are able to think intelligently. Now, I don't think people can innovate when they are illiterate. If the incidence of illiteracy is around 30%, then I consider it one of the constraints, which means when design an industrial policy, we have to factor in the high illiteracy rate as one of the constraints, in addition to the conventional resource constraints that we talk about and that we always discuss. Okay. The neoliberal policy stance, we know all the components there. I'm not going to spend time on it, but what it means for us when thinking about industrial policy is that actually it narrows the policy space available for national entities when they think about designing their stance, because you have price liberalization, trade liberalization, liberalization of FDI, and privatization as well, and actually curtailing government intervention around. And the term used in Egypt, let me tell you, is a free market economy. Now, I don't think in a free market economy you can seriously entertain thinking about industrial policy as Professor Lee defined it for us and as we normally understand it to be. This is par excellence an act of government intervention. The question is, how can the government intervene? It cannot intervene in a free market economy, of course. So the augmented Washington consensus is another constraint, in addition to the WTO. So in fact, we should think of a trio, that is the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, between the three of them, constraining the policy space available for national. It doesn't mean that you end up with the 0 degrees of freedom. I don't think so. I think there are plenty of degrees of freedom, but we have to think about them. Okay. So the conduct of industrial policy becomes more complicated under the augmented Washington consensus. Now, let us think, when we entertain the issue of structural transformation in MENA, about how the economic structure looks like. At this time, we're talking. At this time, you have the following. These are shares of GDP back in 2015. They did not change much from that time. Agriculture, the share of agriculture in GDP is barely 10%. In fact, it's this number, 9 point something. Agriculture is 6%, and oil and gas is 23%. Of course, with low prices, when prices were high, and when prices are going to rise, the share of that sector is going to rise proportionally, okay? And then services, 51%. So we have the issue of structural transformation for MENA is very important, because you have a structure of production that is, let me say, very outdated. Outdated meaning that the share of agriculture is very low. The share of manufacturing is very low, and the share of services is very high, 51%. But you may say that, okay, according to the stylized facts, as countries develop, the share of services will rise, and 51% actually is comparable to what you observe in developed countries. That's right as far as numbers go. But as far as the content of the numbers, it doesn't go. The content of the service sector in the MENA region is something quite different from the content in the developed countries, is something related to research, innovation, and achievements in the industrial sector. In this part of the world, no. In fact, you have last resort for those who don't find work, either in agriculture or in manufacturing. They fly to that sector. So what you know is that we need to think about and act about structural transformation. And what is the direction of structural transformation? Well, let's say away from services towards agriculture and manufacturing, and moving into more productive industries within each sector of these. That is what the data tell us structural transformation should involve. Okay. The issue of food, I don't want to emphasize, but I don't want it to be under-emphasized. It's a very crucial issue. Even if you think about macro stability, macro stability can't control, or you can't regulate prices, or you can't stabilize prices if you suffer in terms of food security. So an issue that, and I think if we understand industrial policy in the broader sense, meaning that moving resources to where the capability of the economy would be higher, facing the food security issue qualifies as an element of industrial policy in this sense of the word. Okay. The issue of illiteracy I talked about, but again, I would like us to think about what it implies in terms of all the important things that Professor Lee talked about when he talked about inter-sector upgrading, intra-sector upgrading. All this is very important there. Finally, the importance of institutions. The issue in the background of all what he was saying, that you have strong and qualified institutions. And those were built over time. But the building those were targeted. MENA, I think, lacks the requisite institutions that would undertake to design and implement an industrial policy. That doesn't mean we just quit and do nothing. No, we should seriously start thinking about the issue of institutions. Now, when we talk about institutions, not only economic institutions, I would like to say, but social institutions, economic institutions, and political institutions. How he was mentioning the remarkable increase in the restrictions imposed on the executive. Here you have a different world altogether, which means that as a worker in the political field myself, this issue is very dear to me, but it's also very important when we entertain economic policy. I think social institutions should be emphasized, and I hope we take it up. Okay. Why didn't we have structural transformation in this MENA region? Well, you have, how to explain this? This is one of the questions that were asked for me to address, and I say, well, there are various candidates for explanation. One is Dutch disease, or resource curse. The social order approach gives some insights into that, and then the Lewis model, the famous Lewis model, gives incentive to that as well. But I would like to emphasize cultural factors, political factors, and social factors. And allow me, social factors stressing status quo in popular songs and religious styles. If you actually do a content analysis of the songs that people in this part of the world hear day in, day out, they actually emphasize the status quo, which means that it's built into the conscious of the individual that, well, it's fine the way things are, with some exceptions, of course. So without doing something about that, and the start is the educational system and the content of that, you can still talk about industrial policy, but you don't hope to get as much as you want to get from it. Political effect. Of course, when I said cultural, I would like to include here also the religious views that are in vast circulation. One has to have the courage to put this point publicly on the table for discussion. What kind of religious values are being promoted? And what are the implications of those for daily behavior, ways of thinking, attitudes towards self and other? These are very vital issues. And also important for industrial policy. These are the cultural factors in brief. The political factors, the nature of the ruling elites. We have despotic rulers everywhere you look, whether it's a republic or a kingdom or a sultanate, it doesn't matter. In terms of what Professor Lee said, the restrictions on the executive are at their bare limit, if any, which means that if you think about a state with people and government and land, then the people have to have some place in this triangle of the state. So that's it. These could be derived from the new structural economics. Sorry, but social factors are mercantile groups and comprador classes are very strong. And let me tell you, as a minister, I had a hell of a time dealing with mercantile groups and comprador class. I can tell you that from real life experience. And they are there. Now, is it better for the society to set up industry, to make jobs, to export? Yes, it's better. But why don't we do it? Because it's still more profitable to import. And because those who import are so powerful that they can actually prevail in any debate about the issue. So these are, I don't think we can entertain industrial policy in the MENA region without dealing with these issues. We have to face them. Okay, now, Samir, how much time do we have? How many minutes? According to your clock. 5 minutes? Okay. Now, Professor Lee has actually defined industrial policy for us. And essentially, it's about building capabilities for the society to think and to act. That's what it is. In terms of actually moving resources around the economy from less productive to more productive activities. So that's the essence of it, okay? But now it says it applies to restructuring policies in favor of more dynamic activities, generally regardless of whether those are located within industry or manufacturing per se, okay? And I do this mistake all the time. Thank you, Marwa, for helping me out. Okay. So this, if we split it in favor of more dynamic activities, then generally industry is more dynamic than agriculture, of course, and more dynamic than services as it is. And I would include in this definition that promoting agriculture and agriculture activities in conformity with global warming and environmental change, and also local needs in the region, qualify as part of industrial policy. Now, what are the limits under WTO? Professor Lee has talked about this at length, and he indicated what's permissible and what's permissible under WTO. And speaking from experience, oftentimes actually, policymakers and governments in this part of the world forego certain things that are permissible under WTO, and they claim that they are not permissible. So we have not reached the maximum degrees of freedom available under WTO, although in fact was very narrowed. But I would like to add that, in fact, thinking about industrial policy in MENA, we have to think about the environment within which industrial policy will be designed and implemented, and that environment is primarily mandated by the trio, which I named before, meaning the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF. The three of them actually define the policy space available for, which means that we have to fight not on just one front, but on three fronts together, particularly when, with regard to Bretton Woods, there is the simple conditionality, but then there is the other conditionality, bilateral, meaning that conditionality between mutual okay? So that's a point that actually makes thinking about okay, now if we were to, and that's my last statement here, in terms of priorities, there has to be a revolutionary change of the educational system. The issue of illiteracy has to be put at the top of the national policy agenda. Issue number one. Issue number two, you have to deal with the issues of social values and social factors that I dealt with. But then the problem of food security, because with food security, you can plan to have cheap labor force and use that cheap labor force to move somewhere in the economy which is more dynamic and more productive, and hence increase GDP within the sustainable limit that I indicated before. Number three, I say this, I don't want to insult anybody, but I think we have to educate executives in this part of the world about what it means to deal with the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF. They don't uphold the ultimate wisdom. They have their own agenda, and national entities do have their own agenda, and that sets the stage for the environment within which industrial policy is to be conducted in this. And finally, with regard to the new normal, Ibrahim, I'm not sure, maybe we're moving back towards the old normal of high oil prices. And then the issue is, do we return back to everything, business as usual, or we learn the lesson that it's not going to be everlasting? There will be another downswing in the cycle, and we have to make sure that we are able to face that. And of course, that relates to the nature of political regimes, the political elite, and also to institutions. And that's my final point. Thank you very much for your overbearing.